Alright, it's been a while since I've done a comic retrospective, and while stuff like my video on The Star Wars will be broken down into a retrospective of the full story, I thought I'd look back on some episodic comics as well and break down those stories, notable moments, and just kind of look back at some notable monthly comic runs, with us starting out with Amazing Spider-Man. This video will cover the first 20 issues and Amazing Fantasy 15 for good measure, as this is kind of the start of everything Spider-Man related. Spider-Man was co-created by writer Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko, and was one of the rare characters not developed with Jack Kirby, as the co-creator was Stan Lee. Stan Lee conceptualized the character off of the Spider, who was a pulp hero from the 1930s and 40s, not too dissimilar to how Bill Finger and Bob Kane were heavily inspired by the Shadow in the creation of their hero, Batman. Pulp heroes are really the grandfathers of the superhero genre in a lot of ways, and following the successful creation of the Fantastic Four, which revitalized Marvel as a superhero powerhouse, Stan Lee wanted to create more superheroes, thinking one that could play better to their teen audience, that adult characters were a power fantasy that better related to kids. Stan, however, realized the power of the everyman and started kicking around the idea of a character with spider-based powers that was also a teen to fit the role. The Spider had kind of an ambiguous allegiance, with both lawmen and the criminal underbelly wanting to get the hero, which Stan liked about the character and pulled forward into his writing with early Spider-Man books, featuring the web crawler dodging both the law and villains at the same time. From an art standpoint, Stan wanted the hero to have a hyphen in his name, since Spider-Man was to have a blue and red costume, feeling calling him Spider-Man without the hyphen, with the same general color thesis as Superman, may draw unwanted comparisons, or people might get confused on the newsstands. Steve Ditko, when he came onto the project, envisioned Spider-Man having a purple and orange costume, though Stan was steadfast in wanting blue and red. Martin Goodman, Marvel's editor at the time, wasn't really feeling the pitch, but Stan managed to convince him, given the fact that he would stuff it in a doomed series like Amazing Adult Fantasy for the trial run. The book renamed simply Amazing Fantasy to maintain the fact that Spider-Man was a character meant to attract teens. The book ended up selling well, with Amazing Fantasy being replaced with Amazing Spider-Man on the newsstands, and Amazing Spider-Man becoming one of Marvel's highest-selling titles ever for about 60 years now. Jack Kirby took the first crack at bringing the character to life, though Lee thought that Jack Kirby's larger-than-life style was a bit much for this down-to-earth hero, so after a few test pages, Lee took Kirby off the project and gave planned inker of the book, Steve Ditko, a chance to produce the book, whose more quaint and down-to-earth style meshed better with Stan Lee's vision, and so the pair started working together to make a pilot run for Spider-Man. Ditko fleshed out how he wanted the character to look, as well as giving Spider-Man a non-traditional mask that covered his entire face, which was uncommon with most heroes of this day having domino masks or cowls like Batman, with the Fantastic Four not covering their faces at all. This would add more mystery and hide from the public that this was a teenage hero rather than your run-of-the-mill adult hero, as was common, as well as giving Spider-Man more of an outlaw feel. Steve Ditko had some help from his artist buddy on creating the feel of the character, working with Eric Stanton, who was Ditko's roommate, and was a notable fetish artist from the 1960s, making, well, fetish material basically. Jack Kirby, who didn't always get along with his most famous collaborator Stan Lee, claims he and his Captain America co-creator Joe Simon had more involvement in the character than Lee, and that Stan's over-exaggerated tales would suggest otherwise, with Kirby showing Lee some concepts him and Simon worked on in the 50s for a title called The Silver Spider, which the pair attempted to create for Crestwood Publications, a dead comic studio of that era that never saw the concept finished, which inspired his look for Spider-Man when Lee first approached him. Ditko ended up adding things like the wall crawling and wrist webs along with the final design, despite Ditko fighting for the suit to be colored quite differently than it ended up being. Joe Simon, for his part, disputed this story, saying that he came up with the Spider-Man name for a comic before renaming it to Silver Spider, further bringing question to the original concept behind Spider-Man's creation. Despite all this, Joe Simon came to the conclusion that the most likely story was that he and Jack created a spider-based character that was very similar to the Fly, an Archie Comics character for the time created by the duo before Jack's return to Marvel, and that the plan was basically to make a version of that character, but a spider instead, which wasn't super unheard of given Joe Simon and Jack Kirby's tendency to recycle. See the Guardian, their Captain America clone that they made for DC. So it's likely that Jack basically repitched the character to Stan as the Spider-Man, and Stan liked the concept of a spider-based hero, but wanted him to be a teenager, and Kirby's art was a bit too epic, wanting something more quaint, which is why he brought Steve Ditko in and took out Jack Kirby. At which point, Ditko would get rid of much of what Jack Kirby did and retool it from a clone of Joe Simon and Jack Kirby's The Fly character into the character we know and love today, with Stan Lee basically adding the teen element and giving Steve Ditko a thumbs up or a thumbs down on ideas. So is Jack Kirby and Joe Simon responsible for the creation of Spider-Man, as Jack Kirby claims? Kinda, on a conceptual level, but not really. Ditko perhaps also explained this well, acknowledging Jack Kirby's contributions, but basically saying it is his version and Jack's version of the character was very different, likening it to Jack's interpretation of Thor compared to the original Norse mythology, which shared the name and concept and very little else. Regardless, as comics of the day and credit went, Jack Kirby felt a bit slighted to be left out on the Spider glory, and while Jack's contributions to comics are most famous for his work with Lee and Marvel, it isn't unheard of that Jack had disputes with Lee and Marvel. This would ultimately lead to him leaving Marvel down the line and returning to another stint at DC, as well as smaller publishers, which I'm sure we'll cover, along with the fact that Steve Ditko would also leave the Spider-Man book and Marvel altogether, before dropping off the grid of mainstream comics down the line. Both of those stories, however, are for another day. For now, let's talk about the books and characters Stan Lee and Steve Ditko created in their early run for Spider-Man, going back to the beginning with Amazing Fantasy 15. Amazing Fantasy 15 was the trial run for what would become the Amazing Spider-Man series, with the character being piloted in one of the 4 stories in the book. Spider-Man's story was named, Spider-Man. The other stories were The Bell Ringer, Man in a Mummy Case, and There's Martians Among Us, these backup features being more in line with the first 14 issues of the series. The book had an original cover done by Steve Ditko, but it's worth noting the iconic final cover was done in part by Jack Kirby, which I think adds further to Kirby's claims of helping with the character's creation and kind of being cheated out of credit on it. The story follows Peter Parker, a young outcast who lives with his Aunt May and Uncle Ben when he's bitten by a radioactive spider. This makes him Spider-Man, though initially Spider-Man is unsure of what to do with his new power after the murder of his Uncle Ben, and he learns he needs to use his power to fight evil. Pretty simple, not much different than later Spider-Man origins. The character has very much kept his iconic origin elements, where anyone with a base knowledge of the character wouldn't be surprised by the plot of this issue and its plot points. The story introduces our young, geeky protagonist Peter Parker, who's an outcast with problems in his life and finds himself with these extraordinary powers. Obviously, Peter has had some new allies and enemies through the years, but unlike a character like Batman, he hasn't really seen many changes since his origin in terms of personality and feel. Other key characters include Uncle Ben. He's only in this issue technically, as a living person. Uncle Ben is Peter's father figure and frequent motivation to go on as things get tough. Also, his death inspires Spider-Man to become the hero he is. Aunt May, who is a constant in Spider-Man's journey as a character, is an old woman who has health and money issues but really loves her little boy. Later she gains more depth, but this is how she's written originally, when created by Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. Liz Allen is introduced in this book and is one of Peter's key love interests, pre-Gwen Stacy, during his high school days. In the comics, Betty Brant and Liz Allen really fill the romance aspects of the story during Peter's high school days until he graduates and meets Gwen in his early college issues. She at first turns her nose at Peter, though as she learns how cruel Flash Thompson is, she starts seeing Peter as an intelligent and sweet guy. Flash Thompson is Peter's bully and a main cast member during Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's high school run. He's sort of your run-of-the-mill bully character, calling Peter a loser and whatever other name he can come up with and trying to beat him up constantly. The burglar is the man who killed Uncle Ben. He's unnamed in this book and to this day has never been fully revealed, minus the name Carradine. That's pretty unimportant to the narrative. What's important is that a crime took place, Uncle Ben got shot, so Peter wants to fight crime. This is a solid introduction issue. It shows the cast very well, and while much of the cast hasn't shown up yet, it sets up a future for Peter as we go deeper into his story. Amazing Spider-Man 1 is the first issue of Spider-Man's main flagship series to this day, 60 years later, and is the official start of the run with Stan Lee and artist Steve Ditko. The first issue features 2 stories, Spider-Man and Spider-Man vs. the Chameleon. Spider-Man follows Peter Parker saving John Jameson, the son of J. Jonah Jameson, who we know hates Spider-Man. John Jameson is an astronaut, and his rocket has a malfunction, causing Spider-Man to need to rescue him. Spider-Man vs. the Chameleon sees Spider-Man in the first crossover he has, meeting the Fantastic Four, who he hopes will hire him on so he can make some money for his Aunt May. They tell him they're a non-profit, as is most superheroes, so Spider-Man leaves annoyed. The Fantastic Four then proceed to debate on the new hero and his intentions. Meanwhile, Spider-Man gains his first rogue in the Chameleon, who uses disguises to steal defense plans. He succeeds, and after disguising himself as Spider-Man, lures the new hero to the base where he stole the plans in a Spider-Man costume to try to frame him. Spider-Man ends up being framed as planned, but after capturing the Chameleon, who is on the way to give his plans to the Soviets, is still considered a criminal after the Chameleon sneaks away. Spider-Man introduces J. Jonah Jameson, who eventually becomes Peter's boss in the Daily Bugle. As we all know, he hates Spider-Man and wants to see him arrested and tried. He's kind of comic relief, but also just kind of a pain, trying to find out who Spider-Man is and stop him throughout the comic story, mostly fueled by his own overstuffed ego. His son John Jameson, on the other hand, is also here. John doesn't come into play much yet, so we'll expand on him later down the line, but the character eventually becomes the Man-Wolf and other things, so he does come back into play, but he isn't a main cast member early on, the way his father was. In Spider-Man vs. the Chameleon, we meet the Chameleon, Spider-Man's first recurring rogue. The Chameleon is able to change into disguises of many assortments and appears a few times in Spider-Man's early days, often dressing up as the masked hero. The character has been active since this issue, appearing here and there, but never making it to the upper ilk of Spider-Man's vast rogues gallery. This issue is solid enough. I like that he meets the Fantastic Four that early on, and that other heroes are seen as more legitimate than the kid in a spider costume, with the Fantastic Four blasting the kid, all except Reed, who sees that he could one day be a valuable ally or heated enemy. Chameleon is also okay, but the story here was a bit weak on his end. I think that where the story really shines is the first feature, Spider-Man, which just kind of expands the character as this down-on-his-luck kid who tries his best, but it's often in vain. It's decent, but there are also some growing pains as Lee and Ditko figure out their format, with later issues mostly just doing one story rather than a feature and a backup the way these early issues do. Issue 2 also features 2 stories, though there's some notable continuity notes worth mentioning. In the story, the uncanny threat of the Terrible Tinkerer, a gang member disguised as an alien, is later revealed to be Quentin Beck, or Mysterio, though through later continuity editions added in Spectacular Spider-Man 51 from 1981, though this was not Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's original intention, so it's iffy if you want to consider this his true first appearance or his retroactive first appearance. For the case of this video, I'm not going to. Aspects of the duel to the death with the Vulture are expanded upon in 2014's Amazing Spider-Man 1.2 and 1.3 from Volume 3 of the Amazing Spider-Man run, and an unnamed secretary at the Bugle is named later in Untold Tales of Spider-Man 12 as Eleanor, Betty Brant's mother, who later gets brain damage and is replaced by Betty at the Bugle. Spider-Man's a pretty weird concept, lots of weird shit happens. This book is also the first Marvel comic to feature a corner box, something Marvel created early in the superhero boom at their studio, though the first to be published was Fantastic Four 14, though the idea came from Ditko for this book. The story of Duel to the Death with the Vulture follows a new villain, the Vulture, who is running amok in New York, who plans to rob the Park Ave jewelry exchange. Upon their first meeting, Spider-Man is defeated but captures some pictures to sell to J. Jonah Jameson of the Vulture. Spider-Man meets the Vulture again, and this time, despite the Vulture striking from below, Spider-Man wins the fight. The uncanny threat of the terrible Tinkerer follows Peter, who's hired as an assistant to Professor Cobwell for the weekend, running errands for the Tinkerer's repair shop. As it turns out, there are aliens that are spying on customers with the help of the Tinkerer, who is putting these spy devices in customers' radios. Spider-Man is captured and put in a death trap, but Spider-Man manages an escape and makes chase, but Spider-Man finds the mask that appears to imply that the Tinkerer is also an alien. Though, as I said, this was all retconned to be a team-up between the Tinkerer and Mysterio later on. Adrian Toomes, or the Vulture, is a longtime Spider-Man villain that makes his first appearance here as the villain the Vulture. He's a well-known staple of the series, appearing as the primary villain in Spider-Man Homecoming, but also being a frequent member of the Sinister Six, constantly trading blows with Spider-Man. The Tinkerer also first appeared here, being Phineas Mason, and despite the end of this issue implying otherwise, he is a human villain, who isn't used a ton, though he is notably kind of a villain of the wider Marvel Universe, trading blows with S.H.I.E.L.D. a lot and other heroes. The book has 2 solid enough stories, though the short format definitely lacks the page count of later Spider-Man stories, which dig in more on the human drama that I think makes Spider-Man such a lasting character. I would say the first story with the Vulture is pretty good. The Vulture is interesting and definitely hit the ground running as a lasting villain in the series. The Tinkerer's story is a little weirder, and while it's on brand for Marvel's line from the day, which was transitioning from sci-fi and horror into the DC-dominated superhero market, it still feels weird for a character that is so street-level like Spider-Man in his early years to fight aliens. He really didn't get cosmic till team-ups with cosmic heroes down the line, when books like Marvel Team Up happens, and more so after he receives his black suit during Secret Wars. Aliens won't be talked about much in these early days of Amazing Spider-Man issues. Amazing Spider-Man 3 is the first issue in the series to only have 1 story in the issue rather than 2, as was the original format. The issue had its story expanded in Spider-Man Unlimited 3 and 18, and Spider-Man Dr. Octopus Out of Reach 1 and 3. The story follows Spider-Man's first meeting with Dr. Octopus, who after an explosion at his lab has 4 mechanical arms he uses for atomic research fused to his body, and he becomes evil. The explosion, however, also allows him to control these limbs by thought, which he uses to take over the hospital he was being treated at. Spider-Man heads in, hoping to take some photos, but after realizing there are some hostage staffers, he ends up fighting Dr. Octopus, but is defeated, with Dr. Octopus escaping the scene. Doc Ock takes over an atomic laboratory, and Spider-Man pursues, even in the face of defeat, since he realizes he needed to do it after a speech by the Human Torch. Spider-Man uses a chemical cocktail to fuse Doc Ock to his arms, and then easily defeated the foe. This issue is notable for being the first appearance of Dr. Octopus, who could easily have become one of those Silver Age one-off villains we often lampoon or see creators lampoon, if not for how serious the original media begins taking him. Much like Green Goblin, Otto starts looking increasingly dangerous over time, with Doc Ock killing George Stacy, Gwen's dad, dated Aunt May on and off, died and came back to life a few times, then died and came back to life later. But not really, because he transferred his brain and took over the body of Spider-Man for a brief cult classic run with the Superior Spider-Man, which briefly took over for this book, only to wipe his brain, but then it comes back, and he's just put in a clone body, which then dies, but now he's in a new clone body. Dude, this is a wild character. It's a pretty good Silver Age comic issue, nothing crazy, but it works and is probably most worth reading, just because it's the first appearance of a fan favorite character. The This also proves so much that the pacing of Spider-Man's adventures worked way better across the whole issue as interpersonal drama starts dripping into these stories more and more, creating the vibe that made Marvel unique against DC in this era, which very much focused on villain plots. I like both companies a lot, even from the day, but that's what made these companies way different back then, rather than today, where it seems like the only real difference is the selection of characters roaming around the universe. Amazing Spider-Man issue 4 doesn't slow the momentum set up in the previous issue, with this issue introducing the Sandman. Mark Waid, a writer who took over Amazing Spider-Man years after this book, retconned a segment of the book to reveal Jessica Jones was one of the spectators watching Spider-Man fight Sandman. The origin of Sandman has also been retconned a few times and is fairly vague here, likely leading editorial staff to fail not to change its origin by mistake a few times. Spider-Man is starting to be seen as a public menace because J. Jonah Jameson schemes, which annoys Peter, though he eventually, while in his Spider-Man suit, runs into a new villain, the Sandman. After a scuffle, Sandman rips Spider-Man's mask, so he must flee. Later, Peter is caught in the middle of some school drama between Liz Allen and Flash Thompson, and Sandman barges into the high school after he decides he needs a place to hide out. Spider-Man eventually finds out, which climaxes with him sucking the villain into an industrial vacuum system, defeating the villain. This issue has a couple notable first appearances, notably Sandman, who goes by the alias Flint Marko, but his true name is later revealed to be William Baker. Sandman has been a major Spider-Man villain ever since his first appearance, eventually showing up in the third Spider-Man film as the antagonist. Let's see, he started off as a villain, became a good guy for a few years, eventually turning evil again, and at one point fought with the Avengers and Justice League to save both the Marvel and DC universes. He's a pretty strange character as well. Betty Brant first appears in this issue. She's a very important aspect of the Steve Ditko and Stan Lee run, being Peter's first serious girlfriend. Dating her on and off, but following the death of her brother, which we'll come back to soon, Spider-Man decides his life is too adventurous for her, so he dumps her around when Gwen Stacy is introduced. Regardless, I feel this character is underrepresented by the films and fans. Betty eventually moves on and marries Ned Leeds, a reporter who eventually becomes the Hobgoblin, but not really, which is her main through arc in the comics following her departure from the main cast. The comic is kind of okay. I like Sandman, but I think the lead up to the rematch was a little rushed. Like, Sandman just decides hiding out in an open public high school was a good idea, then Spider-Man vacuums him up. I don't know. It's weak, it's sort of odd. I will say I like the human drama with Peter in a bit of a love triangle with Flash and Liz. Like I said, the human drama in this book is probably my favorite part, so I think this format is slowly improving despite the odd issue we have here. Spider-Man is a character who in his early years mostly lived in his own pocket of the Marvel Universe, only crossing over with a few heroes here and there in cameos and mostly keeping to his own rogues gallery, but in issue 5 of Amazing Spider-Man, the titular hero goes up against Dr. Doom, who is most well known as a villain of the Fantastic Four, who has since become a bigger villain in the wider Marvel Universe. Still, this was fairly unusual for the day and kind of fun to see. More crossovers between Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four IP, which in this era was the most common pairing of superheroes in the blossoming Marvel Universe. Peter is talking shit about Spider-Man to stave off suspicion that he's the masked crime fighter, which leads Flash Thompson to scold Peter since Flash is Spider-Man's #1 fan despite Peter being his #1 enemy, ironically. Dr. Doom, however, hearing of a new vigilante, decides to see what's up with Spider-Man and sway him to his cause in defeating the Fantastic Four. Doom ends up using a device that can send a signal to Spider-Man through his, I guess, well-known spider sense, and Spider-Man shows up to see what the signal was all about. Dr. Doom gives Peter the classic villain join me speech, which Spider-Man declines, leading to a battle, but Spider-Man ends up heading off, knowing he's no match for Doom unprepared. Meanwhile, Flash Thompson hopes to scare Peter by dressing as Spider-Man and roughing him up, but while in costume, Dr. Doom ends up seeing the boy and captures Spider-Man, or, Flash Thompson. Spider-Man fights Doom again, not getting defeated this time, but leaving before the Fantastic Four show up, which causes Dr. Doom to leave and Spider-Man to also leave, not knowing if he wants to be associated with the super team after the first issue of the series and their denial of him. Regardless, Flash is rescued and everyone is happy. This is kind of early in the ways of a Marvel team-up. There are a few in the Golden Age when Marvel, then Timely's, cast of characters was fairly small, but it wasn't until the 60s that comic writers really started crossing characters over. While the comics landscape in mainstream Marvel and DC books today, we see constant crossovers. That really wasn't the case back in the day. Super teams like the Justice Society being novel back in the day, and not even usually teaming up in the issues that they were in together, being more of a story framework for the anthology. It wasn't until the Justice League we really had in-universe crossovers, and even that was strictly for members of the team. Marvel and Stan Lee wanted a world where the Fantastic Four could bump into Spider-Man, or the Human Torch could rival Spider-Man. They aren't on a team per se, but they could bump shoulders occupying the same space, and I think it's cool seeing an early idea of that kind of cohesion in these publishers. That makes this issue pretty novel, though with that said, not much happens in this book. It's a pretty quick couple of Spider-Man Doom scuffles with a somewhat weak framework. Though I enjoy, on top of adding cohesion to the Marvel Universe, showing more of Peter's rivalries and love life, which is important to the character. Again though, I think these early issues just kind of put pieces in place for when it starts getting real solid later on. After a brief detour on that pseudo-crossover with the Fantastic Four, the innovation returned to Amazing Spider-Man number 6, which features Spider-Man's newest foe, the Lizard. The story sees Peter Parker and J. Jonah Jameson on a trip to Florida after reports start emerging of lizard men. Peter figures this may need his intervention, but also figured he could sell pictures of the lizard to J. Jonah Jameson for top dollar, convincing the media mogul to fly him to Florida to see what's going on. Peter manages to get J. Jonah Jameson off his trail by saying he needed to buy some camera equipment, allowing Peter to dress up and start investigating. Spider-Man goes to meet Kurt Connors, who he found out is the resident lizard expert in the area, and his wife confides in him that he is secretly the lizard, who after losing an arm in World War II tried to regrow it using lizard DNA. This would later be retconned in the classic Marvel style to be any war that happened 20-ish years before whatever year it is. The sliding time scale of the universe works this way to keep up with modern times. It's both simple and confusing, but you can look into it further if you want a better explanation than I just gave. Regardless, in this story it was World War II. The lizard attacks Connor's home, but Spider-Man fends him off, realizing he needs to make an antidote, which he manages to do. He finds the lizard, and after dodging the lizard's army of lizards that are trying to defend, well, the lizard, Spider-Man changes Curtis back into his human form, and everyone's happy. As I stated, this is the first appearance of the lizard and his wife Martha and son William. The lizard is a very odd character, as you probably know, even if you only saw him in his film appearances. The lizard is typically Curtis Connors, and when he isn't the lizard, he's an ally and friendly scientist who works with Peter. However, he always goes back to being the lizard, one way or another. Marvel and DC like to rip each other off a lot to this day, and Man-Bat from Batman is definitely a late lizard clone. At one point, his wife Martha dies of cancer and comes back to life as a lizard woman, and Curtis also eats his son alive at one point. Then his son comes back years later as, you guessed it, a lizard. Lizard always has been a fascinating character for me. He is so weird and no one ever really knows what to do with him, but I also kind of love him for it. This issue is pretty fun. There's a little bit of teenage stuff at the start of the book, as always, but it's kind of fun having Spider-Man jettison off to fight outside of New York and to fight someone so different. It's really solid, and the lizard is another unique add to his growing rogues gallery. Issue 7 sees the return of Vulture, which is also the name of the story the issue contains, being the first time a villain returns in the series. The story follows the Vulture, who after breaking out of prison is back at it and looking for revenge on Spider-Man. Spider-Man finds the Vulture first and attacks, hoping to beat him the same way he did the first time, but fails, causing Spider-Man to injure his arm. However, Spider-Man doesn't have long to sulk, as when he heads to the Daily Bugle to sell pictures he caught of the Vulture, J. Jonah Jameson is there and the Vulture's trying to stick him up for the Bugle's payroll checks. Peter changes into Spider-Man and the pair fight by the Bugle building, with Vulture raising Spider-Man into the air, causing him to have to hang on by his webs. He webs up Vulture's wings, putting them in a free fall, but Peter manages to make a web parachute, defeating the villain. Peter heads back to the Bugle, and J. Jonah Jameson is pissed. However, Peter starts interacting and hiding out with Betty Brant from J. Jonah Jameson, marking her first significant appearance in the run, and moving her into the love interest she becomes later on. This issue isn't bad. It's nice to flesh out the Vulture a bit, since we only get him in half of one issue when he started his first appearance with the Tinkerer in issue 2. Vulture still has some charm, and I like the continuity through line that someone with the mechanical genius of the Vulture learned from his first battle against Spider-Man a bit. This comic, of course, has the contrivances you'd expect from an early Spider-Man comic, though, like the Vulture deciding to fly into the Bugle's window to rob the place of its payroll, which seems convenient given that that happens to be where Peter is. Not so different from Sandman wandering in to hide out in an occupied high school in the middle of the day, but they had 22 pages and had to make something happen, so I can't really be that mad about it, especially in these goofy earlier issues. I think the second fight with Spider-Man and the Vulture was very dynamic and kind of added to the verticality of both Spider-Man and his opponent, which I think is something that becomes more important later on. Amazing Spider-Man 8 is a comic that features 2 stories, much like the earlier issues of the series, notably featuring a more thorough team-up with the Human Torch. The Terrible Threat of the Living Brain is the first story, which sees a new robot, the Living Brain, being displayed at Midtown High, while Peter and Flash get in a fight. This computer is able to solve any problem, and the question posed to it by the class is, who is Spider-Man? Something Peter fears will blow his cover. The answer is given out by the robot as a code, and Peter is tasked with decoding it, though Flash steals it, which leads to Mr. Warren, their teacher, to recommend the boys box it out in the ring. I don't know if teachers are allowed to recommend a sanctioned fight between students today, but back in the 60s, I guess students boxed similarly to how clout YouTubers do or something. Peter fears he will defeat Flash too easily given his spider strength, which he does, but the class calls it a lucky shot. Anyhow, the Living Brain goes on a destructive rampage and Spider-Man manages to stop him. Peter takes the code he got from the Living Brain as to Spider-Man's identity and just claims it was Flash Thompson, potentially putting his rival in mortal danger for Hux, I guess, which I greatly respect. Spider-Man tackles the torch, sees Peter ending up at a party thrown by Dory Evans. She is the girlfriend of the Human Torch at the time, and in a move characteristic of a young teenage Peter, changes into Spider-Man and tries to outdo his rival at the party. The duo end up throwing hands, and they end up on a beach where the Fantastic Four is chilling, leading to the end of the fight. Spider-Man thinks the Fantastic Four is making fun of him, so he dips, but not before letting them know how they're all dicks, basically. The Living Brain originates in this issue, and he's a robot in a very 60s style that ends up confronting Spider-Man. The character is pretty obscure, but appeared a small number of times over the decades. However, it's more of a one-off creation than an actual long-term Spider-Man villain. This is a decent comic. It is almost refreshing that it was kind of just a short vignette, and I think the relationship between Spider-Man and the Human Torch and Flash is what's most essential to the issue. Peter is a teenager that, despite being mild-mannered, still has confidence as Spider-Man to lash out at bullies and be jealous of both characters in one way or another. These rivalries, I think, define teenage Parker, who is more of a snarky dick than the Peter many of us remember from the films and stuff. He's petty, and as my girlfriend may say, cunty. He isn't one to take BS from anyone, and I think that's a layer to the teenage character that slowly boils down a bit as he grows up in the series. Amazing Spider-Man 9 introduces another major villain, Electro, and is supplemented by Untold Tales of Spider-Man 12, a series that is influential in adding some lore to early Spider-Man issues. The This being that at the end of the issue, Betty talks more about her origin and vaguely mentions that Peter reminds her of someone from her past, as someone that wouldn't be revealed for 32 more years, till Kurt Busiek made up Gordon Savensky. Regardless, though, Electro is a new villain in town and is on a crime spree while Aunt May is having a health crisis. Spider-Man is accused of being Electro by J. Jonah Jameson, and Spider-Man finally tracks the villain down only to be defeated. At this point, we briefly learn of Electro, or Max Dillon's origin story, at which point Spider-Man fights Electro again, this time with rubber boots and rubber gloves to protect him from Dillon's electricity. He wins the fight and sells some pictures to J. Jonah Jameson. He uses this money to help Aunt May, and Peter and Betty share an awkward moment as their romance continues to build. As I said, Electro, or Max Dillon, first appeared in this issue. He's done lots of work in the comics, being one of Spider-Man's major villains, eventually even showing up in the Spider-Man film series portrayed by R&B singer-turned-actor Jamie Foxx. Electro is probably best known as a member of the Sinister Six, with him being one of the most stable members of the group, showing up on the team fairly often. He's one of the less weird characters, though. At one point he was killed and replaced by Francine Fry as the new Electro, but you better believe they brought him back, as is the norm in comics. This is a decent comic. I think over the actual story, it's most well known for bringing us Electro, who has a neat design and became a fan favorite, and a key member of the Sinister Six over the years in the comics, adding another solid addition to Spider-Man's long-term rogues gallery. The rubber gloves and boot trick seemed a little busted on Electro, but it was kind of a perpetual problem with the early issues that Spider-Man wins every battle using his cunning and wits, thus they have to later come up with convoluted ways to reestablish that trick won't work a second time in future issues, but that's kind of part of the formula of these early Amazing Spider-Man titles. Amazing Spider-Man 10 shows the first appearance of the Enforcers, and was further fleshed out in Untold Tales of Spider-Man number 5 through 7. The story follows a crime boss, the Big Man, who assembled a super team called the Enforcers to work under him in New York to try to take over the various gangs in town. J. Jonah Jameson assumes the Big Man is Spider-Man, just like how he thought Spider-Man was Electro in the last issue. This is all well and good, though, until Peter's love interest, Betty, is shaken up by the Enforcers who are trying to collect a debt off of her. Spider-Man confronts the Enforcers, but they make it out, though J. Jonah Jameson shows up to the scene, leading Peter to think that his boss may truly be the Big Man. To get to the bottom of it all, Peter hopes to make Big Man come to him by bragging that he knows who Big Man is, leading the villain to kidnap Peter, at which point he changes into Spider-Man and breaks out. Spider-Man escapes as he fights the Big Man, however it's revealed that Foswell, a reporter for the Daily Bugle, is actually the villain. Though to Peter's surprise, Betty has left town to head back home to get away from the gang, wishing she had help from Spider-Man. This issue shows us the first appearance of Big Man, or Freddy Foswell, who was a gang leader Big Man who would go on to be a reporter for the Bugle for a time before eventually turning back to evil and working under the Kingpin before he would die, protecting J. Jonah Jameson after feeling a guilty conscience. Montana first appeared here as a member of the Enforcers, who, much like many Spider-Man villains, was dead and revived, and he's something of a cowboy villain. Fancy Dan was another Enforcer. He's a fancy man who is a great martial artist, who is also a good shot. Finally, we have the Ox, who is a large man and the muscle of the Enforcers. The Enforcers were a popular early group of villains who, as time went on and things like the Sinister Six were created, seemed less and less necessary, especially since they never caught people's imagination the way the main members of the Sinister Six did, though they still sporadically appear from time to time in the comics. This comic was decent. I think the Enforcers as a team is alright, kind of low-rent villains, and the Big Man is an interesting enough character, with Frederick Foswell, or the Big Man, being a fairly important side character at the Bugle for a number of years after this issue, before being written out of the comic eventually. Issue 11 sees the return of Dr. Octopus, as the cover so gleefully declares. This story, being key to Betty's lore, would be expanded upon in Untold Tales of Spider-Man number 12. Dr. Octopus is let free from prison after serving a brief sentence, but Spider-Man doesn't believe in rehabilitation, so he plans to track Doc Ock's movements, only to find that the car picking him up from prison is being driven by Betty Brant. Spider-Man soon finds out that Betty has decided to help a villain, Blackie Gaxton, see his plan through to bail her brother out of debt he had with the gangster. Peter travels to Philadelphia to confess his love for Betty, but soon after, Betty and her brother are taken hostage. Spider-Man manages to catch up to them and confronts Blackie, who is trying to shoot Betty, but kills Bennett instead. Betty blames Spider-Man, but he has to leave to try to catch Dr. Octopus, who used the chaos to escape. Betty proclaims she hates Spider-Man, and Peter's plan to reveal his identity to her is put on ice for the time being. Bennett Brandt is the main new addition to the lore here, initially being a one-off side character before being revived as the Crime Master to fight Flash Thompson's iteration of Venom. Yeah, so Flash Thompson has become more of a Venom side character in recent years, and they decided to pull Bennett out of the grave to be a new version of the Crime Master, though at the end of the arc, Bennett is killed seemingly for real this time. Though with comics, you evidently never know, and who knows, in 2035 someone might dig up Bennett for one more ride. If you're looking for an in-depth look at Doc Ock hijinks, you may be a bit disappointed. That isn't really what this issue is going to give you, though I think the expansion of Peter's relationship with Betty is an important step in the early comics. I think in other mediums, Betty as a major step in Peter's journey is kind of an afterthought. Mary Jane really became his kind of Lois Lane, and Gwen's death is so iconic in its own right that it's usually mentioned in the lore. I like Betty enough, and I think in a lot of ways she's the prototype for the more iconic women in Spider-Man's life going forward. Regardless, I thought her brother dying was also kind of a good move. It adds some stakes to the book and his relationship to Betty, a move I think they really tried to kind of emulate down the line with George Stacy's death, but I think we're getting about 100 issues ahead of ourselves here. Amazing Spider-Man 12 sees the soft continuation of plotlines from the previous issue. Following the events of issue 11, Betty Brandt is back working at the Daily Bugle as Doc Ock returns to New York as well. Ock figures since Spider-Man saved Betty in their last encounter, he would kidnap Betty and lure Spider-Man into another fight, though Spider-Man's powers are not working due to the crime fighter having some sort of ailment. This leads to Doc Ock wiping the floor with Spider-Man and taking off his mask, which leads Doc Ock to assume Peter foolishly attacked him in a Spider-Man outfit to try to get Betty back, rather than being the real deal. Peter is spared, and this act of seeming heroism leads Liz to gaining a bit of a crush on the hero and notice further the previously unnoticeable Peter. Though soon, Peter regains his powers and makes another run at Doc Ock. This time he wins and the villain is put in jail. Liz asks Peter out, but he tells her to kick rocks, basically. This comic was a good classic Spider-Man tale. I think what's kind of weird is, despite featuring Dr. Octopus, again it really lightly ties to the previous issue, which seems odd to me. I think they could have made this issue 12 or 20 and it really wouldn't matter, since for the most part, the fact that it came out right after issue 11, which also featured the character, is fairly inconsequential. Though with all that said, I think this is where The Amazing Spider-Man starts to really pick up steam and get into the winning formula that made Spider-Man iconic, where those first few issues kind of stumbled to nail down the format exactly. Issue 13 sees Spider-Man fight another landmark foe for the first time. This time it's Mysterio. This book suffered some later retcons. In Amazing Spider-Man Volume 3, number 1.1, it is revealed that Spider-Man inadvertently lost Quentin Beck his job, making him become a supervillain. It's also revealed earlier than that, in Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man number 51, that he is one of the seemingly real aliens that appeared in Amazing Spider-Man 2. However, despite that retcon making Quentin Beck one of the aliens in Amazing Spider-Man 2, it's worth noting the character was actually created for this issue, and that isn't mentioned till years down the line that he very technically appeared in Amazing Spider-Man issue 2. The story shows that Spider-Man is seemingly holding up various locations around the city, which makes Peter think he's got dissociative identity disorder, though he refuses to seek medical help, fearing he may have to give up his secret identity in the process. Peter needs money for the mortgage and sets out to get some pictures, but can't since angry mobs around the city are hounding him for seemingly committing these crimes. Though at the same time, Mysterio shows up at the Daily Bugle to tell J. Jonah Jameson that he is a hero and will bring the evil Spider-Man to justice, telling Jonah to put in the newspaper that he challenges Spider-Man to a battle on the Brooklyn Bridge. Spider-Man shows up and is defeated, though the villain goes to the Bugle for congratulations and a photo op, which lets Peter sneak a tracer on him. Spider-Man follows him to his base, and Mysterio recounts his origins while confessing he created the evil fake Spider-Man, and the duo fight with Spider-Man defeating Mysterio and turning him over to the cops. Peter sells a picture of the fight to J. Jonah Jameson, then comes back as Spider-Man and strings J. Jonah Jameson to the ceiling as a meme. As I said, this issue is the first true appearance of Mysterio, with the villain being a staple of the comics, much like many other characters we brought up in this video. Mysterio's been through some convoluted shit like everyone else, at one point faking his death and giving off the Mysterio identity. He ran a nursing home to steal people's social security checks and faked Aunt May's death at one point. He got cancer, he shot himself, he went to hell, his ghost haunted the Ultimate Spider-Man universe, and he was the Mysterio of that world for a while. Then he came back to life in the main Marvel universe and directed a movie about Mary Jane, with Mary Jane working as the producer. He has to be in the top 10 most convoluted characters of all time. I initially wrote in comics, but Jesus Christ, this is a weird story. I like this issue. Mysterio is one of the weirder looking characters, but I think he's interesting to look at, and the ambient smoke that seems to follow him is something that I think makes the character particularly fun, and adds a cool little look to the artwork, especially since Ditko is also famous for co-creating Doctor Strange with Stan Lee. The pacing is well done, and again, how can you not enjoy seeing the first issue of another iconic comic book character? Stan Lee and Steve Ditko were not ready to take a break from making groundbreaking new villains, with Amazing Spider-Man 14 introducing hands down the most famous Spider-Man villain, and is probably only second to the comparable character of the Joker in infamy for villains. The story sees a new threat in New York, Green Goblin, who's zooming around town on his flying broomstick and hires the Enforcers on his side to get revenge on Spider-Man. Green Goblin then flies across the country to California, where he offers a producer a chance to make a Spider-Man film. He then flies back to New York to get Spider-Man to join the film, which he does since he needs money, and J. Jonah Jameson sends Peter off to cover the story, conveniently giving Peter a cover to head over there. The Green Goblin then meets Spider-Man back in California, and they go to the desert to film a fight sequence, and he has to battle the Enforcers and the Green Goblin. They end up in a cave, and for seemingly no reason, the Hulk is there. Everyone dips, knowing that the Hulk will defeat them all, but the Enforcers got beat down so they could be arrested. The film producer canceled the Spider-Man film in favor of the Hulk, and Peter takes a bus back to New York as Green Goblin thinks of another plan. Green Goblin is introduced in this issue and is a mysterious villain, with the end of the comic eventually hiding his identity, which would be revealed to be Norman Osborn in Amazing Spider-Man 39 a few years down the line. Neither Harry nor Norman were introduced at this point in the comics, and wouldn't for a good while. Stan Lee wanted Green Goblin to be a demon at first, but Steve Ditko changed this to be just some guy. When discussing who the villain was as time went on, Steve Ditko said he wanted it to be a new character, and Stan wanted it to be someone the reader knew. Flash forward to Ditko's final issue, and Norman Osborn is revealed. John Romita Sr. took over, and Stan Lee told him that Norman was meant to be the Green Goblin, though it was widely believed that Steve hoped to use Norman as a red herring rather than the true Green Goblin, and that it is likely that Green Goblin's identity still wouldn't be revealed at that time. Green Goblin had a weird history. He killed Gwen Stacy, adding to his infamy, but later they retconned it, so he had a secret relationship with Gwen Stacy while she dated Peter and got her pregnant with a secret up till then unmentioned child, though this proved to be a false memory and the kids were actually clones after fans got pissed off when they made this decidedly weird plot point. He then died and came back to life, became the Iron Patriot, the Iron Man and Captain America of the Dark Avengers, became the Hobgoblin, the Goblin King, the Red Goblin, Carnage, went back to being the Green Goblin, and now he's something of a superhero known as the Gold Goblin, till assuredly they just bring him back to being the Green Goblin. I don't know, another weird one like Mysterio, I guess. This book is historically important, but honestly is pretty bad. Green Goblin goes on 5 cross-country trips in 22 pages. The film set idea was very convoluted as well, and the Hulk and Enforcers both pad out the issue more than it needed to be. with me wondering why it wasn't just Spider-Man and Green Goblin fighting on a film set or something. With that said, Green Goblin is cool, and he would go on to have many, many, many more run-ins with Spider-Man, many of which are so much more iconic than this too. So despite an underwhelming first appearance, the character would go on to become pretty cool and important as time went on, and it's historically important and worth reading for that if nothing else. Amazing Spider-Man 15 features the first appearance of future feature film star Kraven the Hunter, and that was slightly facetious, but it was also the first mention of Mary Jane, a character that wouldn't appear for a good while cameoing in Amazing Spider-Man 25 and having her first full appearance in Amazing Spider-Man 42. Anyways, we'll get back to all that on the second part of our series on Amazing Spider-Man. Years later, in 1996, the story would be revisited from Kraven's perspective in Sensational Spider-Man 1996 Annual. The chameleon disguised as Spider-Man robs a bank again in an attempt to frame Spider-Man of breaking the law, something he did not do. He then contacts Kraven the Hunter, who thinks Spider-Man would be an interesting hunt. Kraven ambushes Spider-Man, drugging him to weaken Spider-Man so he could start thrashing the guy, but Spider-Man manages to limp off and heal so he could reconfront Kraven later on. Soon, using a spider tracer, he finds Kraven, again, who booby trapped the forest that Spider-Man tries confronting him in. He manages to catch the chameleon, who was disguised as Kraven, though eventually he finds the real Kraven catching him. The police end up deporting Kraven back to his homeland, but Kraven vows to one day return, now obsessed with Spider-Man as the ultimate hunt. Anna Watson first appears here, and she's best friends with Aunt May, a plot device for May to try to set up Spider-Man with Mary Jane. Before Mary Jane actually joined the cast, it was kind of a running gag that Spider-Man assumed she was going to be ugly and deformed, only to pay off way down the line when Mary Jane first appears and Peter learns that she's actually hot. Basically, Anna and May were trying to get Peter's rizz up. It's sort of a tale as old as time, though. Two adults want to set up two of their kids as a means to be a family in some weird shit. Happens all the time. Anyways, past Mary Jane's introduction, Ann Watson isn't really that important. I will likely never find another excuse to bring her up, despite showing up in several issues following her first appearance here. Kraven the Hunter, or Sergei Kravinoff, is the biggest first appearance here and is another strange Spider-Man villain. Okay, so Kraven was basically a B-villain that would eventually be retconned into having been on Nick Fury's Avengers team in the 1950s that preceded Avengers. So in a roundabout way, he's a founding member of the Avengers based on continuity. But anyways, he becomes really obsessed with Spider-Man, and this sees him hunting the crime fighter repeatedly, usually alone but occasionally as part of the Sinister Six. Eventually, a famous comic line happens called Last Hunt, which sees Kraven basically impersonate Spider-Man, then kill himself, at which time we learn that the chameleon was actually his brother and a manservant. Regardless, his sister killed Peter Parker's clone, Kane Parker, then used his body in a voodoo magic ritual to bring Kraven back to life, at which point he started stalking Kane Parker, who was also magically reincarnated, and the only way to break this curse of eternal life was to mess with him. But for shits and giggles, he dressed as Kane's, brother, Ben Reilly, who is a clone of Peter Parker as well. Eventually, he gets cloned into an identical replica of himself known as Last Son of Kraven. That's his name. And Last Son of Kraven is tricked into killing the real Kraven, or his dad, or his genetic template papa, by Kraven, who's dressed as Spider-Man, to trick his son into thinking he was Spider-Man. I don't even know what to say, but I hope all this is adapted into the new Sony Pictures Kraven film. This comic is pretty good. I think Kraven is a neat character, and the idea of the Hunter trying to murder Spider-Man is fun, and I like that it sets up fun little booby trap set pieces that you wouldn't expect from a comic book set in urban New York. I think Chameleon is sort of pointless, but I guess you gotta find a way to bring Kraven into everything, and his robbing the bank does add a very minor conflict to Spider-Man's story, but if I'm being honest, not enough to really warrant the plot point, especially when we just had the Mysterio plot point that was very similar. It's still a solid and fun issue, though, setting up an interesting villain that future writers apparently had no idea what to do with. Alright, following that we have Amazing Spider-Man 16, which is a crossover issue with Daredevil, who was still fairly new at the time, as you may be able to see with his old yellow and brown costume, which, by the way, I love this costume. Might genuinely be my favorite Daredevil suit for some reason. I don't know, I think it just kind of looks unique. Regardless, Peter is swinging around town when he notices some criminals making off with some loot who just decide to try to shake up an innocent bystander that happens to be Matt Murdock. Spider-Man stops them, but is not aware that this man is secretly the Daredevil. Anyways, Matt goes to the circus, which happens to be run by the Ringmaster, a Marvel villain who fought all sorts of heroes, but first premiered against the Incredible Hulk. Ringmaster uses his hat to hypnotize the crowd to rob them and get Spider-Man too, after Peter decides to put on a show for the audience. This leads Daredevil to take action, leading to a classic hero vs. hero fight due to hypnosis, which is a pretty classic reason for heroes to fight. Daredevil saves Spider-Man, and he and Spider-Man defeat the Ringmaster and his Carnival of Crooks. This book has two minor first appearances, being the Great Gambonos brothers, Ernesto and Luigi, who end up becoming stable members of the Ringmaster's Circus of Crime. The other members, the Human Cannonball, Clown, Berto the Strongman, and the Ringmaster himself, all had been around for a while at this point. The comic is solid, I like a good team-up, and this is in a way sort of the start of the Spider-Man Daredevil street-level hero team-ups we see so often these days. Marvel very much has categories for each hero, I think especially over the rival company of DC. At DC it's a crapshoot. Batman is always just chilling with Martian Manhunter, Superman and Green Lantern are randomly entangled sometimes. Marvel, on the other hand, sort of have casts that are most likely to interact for continuity purposes that share some pools of villains. For example, Spider-Man, Daredevil, and Luke Cage are street heroes that fight people like the Kingpin. Iron Man, Captain America, and Thor are Avengers, fighting foes like Kang. Guardians of the Galaxy, Fantastic Four, and Silver Surfer are cosmic. And X-Men fights mutants like Magneto. These lines have seemed to blur more as time has gone on, and people like Spider-Man and Wolverine work on and off with the Avengers or X-Men or Fantastic Four, whatever, but it's a theme at Marvel that there's kind of categories for each hero. The reason I explain all this is because in a lot of ways, this is the first taste of Marvel making Spider-Man bump into a hero in the Streets of New York category, something that eventually becomes pretty frequent in his run. Look, this issue isn't deep, but it's a solid time and worth checking out. Amazing Spider-Man Annual number 1 is the first of many Amazing Spider-Man annuals and introduces the supervillain team, the Sinister Six. It also seemed to be more or less an advertisement for the larger Marvel line of comics from the day. Dr. Octopus is back and starts a new team of supervillains he calls the Sinister Six, recruiting villains Mysterio, Electro, Sandman, the Vulture, and Kraven for the super team, with plans for each of them to attack Spider-Man one by one in rapid succession before he has time to recover. However, that is the least of Peter's problems, as his powers are again acting up and he's unable to use them. The Six recognize Betty as someone who has previously been saved by Spider-Man, so they end up kidnapping her in order to lure Spider-Man. Though it just so happens she's with Aunt May, so they take her too for the hell of it. Vulture leaves J. Jonah Jameson a message telling Spider-Man the Six have spread around New York and that he'll need to defeat each of them. First, he confronts Electro at Stark Tower. Thankfully, Peter gets his powers back, and he manages to defeat him. Iron Man shows up to offer help, but Peter declines. Then he finds Kraven in Central Park, defeating him with some ease. After that, he finds Mysterio, who has some robots made up to have the powers of the X-Men. After Peter wins, he heads to Sandman and Vulture, who he beats before finally confronting the Ringmaster, Doc Ock, in a giant fish tank for some reason. The villains are locked up, pissed at each other, and May chastises Peter as he missed class earlier in the issue. There's also a bonus story that discusses the powers of Spider-Man and demos how they work, adding more clarity to those who couldn't pick it up by themselves, I guess, over these issues. He climbs on walls and is strong and has some web shooters. It's not that hard to understand. The other, probably more notable story was a joke script about how Steve Ditko and Stan Lee created the comics. This book plays it as a joke that Steve basically hates Stan and feels underappreciated, but as we will pretty soon find out, there is more truth to this humor than what was portrayed in this little fun gag story. This issue was the first time that the Sinister Six appeared, and is a long-running supervillain teams writers bring out when they think Spider-Man needs to run a gambit. Along with the villains here, other notable members include the Hobgoblin, Boomerang, Aaron Davis, during his time as the Iron Spider, the Chameleon, the Rhino, Green Goblin, Hammerhead, the Lizard, Scorpion, Venom, and Tombstone. The 6 members featured here are very common additions to the team, but the cast very much rotates writer to writer and arc to arc, kind of like the Justice League or the Avengers, but evil. The team is sometimes the Sinister 7 or 12. There's also an offshoot, the Savage 6, which was Kraven's rival to the Sinister 6. And I guess that was a thing at one point. The comic is a very fun advertisement for the Marvel brand as well as Spider-Man and his characters. It features 6 of Spider-Man's most popular villains to this point, with fun, quick, rapid-fire fights. Not a huge amount of depth, but it has decent action. On top of that, we get cameos from basically everyone floating in the Marvel Universe at the time. You got the original X-Men, the Fantastic Four, Doctor Strange, and a modified team of early Avengers with Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, Wasp, and Giant Man. It's fun, mostly a time capsule of Marvel at a more simple time for a comic, pretty blatantly trying to spread some love to the other books in Marvel's publishing line. Not the best issue, a little gimmicky, but annuals have always been weird hit-or-miss things that comics do, so for an annual, I like it enough. Amazing Spider-Man 17 sees a more fleshed-out team-up with the Human Torch, as well as the return of the Green Goblin. This book, like many early Amazing Spider-Man issues, was expanded in Untold Tales of Spider-Man issue 17, expanding why a yet faceless Mary Jane refuses a date with Peter, since it's revealed she knew Peter was Spider-Man. It's a bit of a weird ad, since it never really seemed to be the case as the series goes on, but whatever, comics do shit like that all the time. Flash Thompson started a fancy Spider-Man dinner club that is being held at Liz Allen's dad's restaurant. Flash promised the fan club an appearance from Spider-Man that he figures Spider-Man would likely show up to if he spread the word. Of course, Peter, despite not being invited, shows up so that he can change into Spider-Man to make an appearance. He starts swinging around when Green Goblin pops up, basically out of nowhere, and engages Spider-Man. This causes the Human Torch, who happen to be there, to jump into action. The duo fight Goblin for a bit when it's revealed Aunt May had a heart attack, so Spider-Man flees, being called a pussyfoot and coward by the media. Green Goblin really just wanted Spider-Man, so he ends up leaving the scene after Spider-Man flees. This comic is kind of weird from a plot perspective, and again teases Green Goblin in a way that, while better than the last time, is still a bit half-baked. It is cool, the character got some new stuff, like his trademark glider though, and the drama and action is good. The only thing I think is weird about this issue is the fact Green Goblin doesn't really have a lot going for him when we don't know exactly who he is, and the mystery isn't really expanded past he showed up. Amazing Spider-Man 18 sees the return of Sandman in the story at the end of Spider-Man. Obviously this wasn't true. One thing to note is that Aunt May refers to Mary Jane a few times as Mary Watkins in this issue. This was a continuity mistake, but later the issue Untold Tales of Spider-Man 19 would explain that this was due to Aunt May's declining health in the story around this time, and that it was a mistake on her part, not the writer's. Following Spider-Man seemingly fleeing his fight with Green Goblin, the town is in a buzz about how cowardly the hero is. Spider-Man tries selling off his patented web fluid to make some cash to care for Aunt May, as her health is still in a really bad place, though no one wants what Spider-Man is selling since he has such a low stock in town after his seeming cowardly actions with the previous issue. This is when Spider-Man runs into Sandman, though he fears Sandman will hurt him and Aunt May will be left all alone, so he flees, which is seen by the public, and people again start to bemoan Spider-Man a coward. Flash Thompson attempts to help Spider-Man's reputation by going out and fighting crime for him while he's in the slump, but Flash gets beat down pretty quickly. However, Peter learns Aunt May is set to recover, allowing him to fight crime again, knowing that the city is still in need. The issue has one major first appearance. Ned Leeds, a character that is probably most well known for his major role in the MCU's Spider-Man, though that version is more or less based off of Gonki, a Miles Morales character. Why they did this in the films, I don't know. That said, Ned kind of creates a love triangle between Peter, Betty, and himself. This eventually resolves with him marrying Betty and Peter kind of more chill with Ned after he gets over Betty. Notably, way down the line in Amazing Spider-Man 257, he becomes Hobgoblin, though we'll get to this eventually perhaps. I don't know, what would that be, like the 18th part of this series? This is a good comic and definitely something of a seminal issue in the Steve Ditko Stan Lee run on Amazing Spider-Man. It's not the most action-packed, doesn't feature a major first appearance, and as I said, Ned wouldn't become a super major character for about 20 years. It's just an issue of high school Peter Parker worrying about money, his aunt Betty, and trying to find himself as Spider-Man. It is Spider-Man from this era to me in its purest form. I really enjoy this issue. Amazing Spider-Man 19 is an action-packed sequel to the more philosophical and character-driven previous issue, and features a cameo from the yet unnamed character Scorpion, Matt Gargan, who we'll talk about more during his first full appearance in a second here. Spider-Man is on a roll, catching burglars and other crooks throughout New York when he bumps into Fancy Dan of the Enforcers. He confronts the Enforcers, but they manage to flee, while Peter meets Ned and, given recent circumstances, is not all that torn up about the romantic rival yet. Soon, however, the readers learn Human Torch is being held prisoner by the Enforcers. Turns out Sandman has the Torch hostage to lure Spider-Man, his true target. Spider-Man indeed shows up, but saves the Human Torch. He defeated the Enforcers and Sandman attempts to flee but is arrested. This is a solid comic. It's mostly an action issue to kind of make up for the slower previous issue, and Sandman's escape that was established in the previous entry. I think the biggest thing introduced in this comic, besides the minor appearance from the Scorpion, was the more thorough look at Ned Leeds, whose introduction I think adds more of a complication to Peter and Betty's relationship in the pre-Gwen and MJ days. Amazing Spider-Man 20 features the first appearance of Scorpion following his cameo in issue 19. Peter can tell by his spider sense that he's being followed by, as it turns out, Matt Gargan, a private investigator who visits Dr. Sitwell, a scientist who can make Gargan stronger. J. Jonah Jameson goes with Gargan and observes the PIs turn into the Scorpion. Spider-Man is naturally confronted by the Scorpion eventually, though after being knocked out by Scorpion, Dr. Sitwell gains consciousness in time to attempt to stop his mad creation with a cure, but is killed in the process. Spider-Man eventually stops the Scorpion, who is becoming more maddened by his strange new powers. Scorpion has his first full appearance here. Matt Gargan is most well known for being Scorpion, kind of a B-villain in the Spider-Man lore, who I think should be more well known, but due to the false start tease in the MCU, hasn't seen a major mainstream appearance yet. Mac, however, has not only been Scorpion, but was also Venom for a good while, and even took on the Spider-Man mantle in the Dark Avengers, and at one point for some reason he even had a War Machine armor and was kind of doing an Iron Man thing. But most recently he's just become a version of Scorpion, mixed with a Venom symbiote from Earth 1051. He is also one of the rare Spider-Man villains to have at no point died in his 60 years of existence, a shockingly rare feat. This was kind of a solid one-off. I like Scorpion quite a bit. I think he's just another great addition to the iconic Rogues Gallery, which was largely created during these first 20 issues. It's an unbelievable run of Spider-Man villains introduced, only rivaled by Batman, but I think the villains are as important to the story as the heroes in terms of lasting appeal and cinematic success. So it was important to have a run like this to establish the characters, which is why I think Spider-Man and Batman always sit up there as some of the most iconic characters in American media. Anyways, that was the early part of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's Spider-Man run. Ditko's run is fairly short for being the co-creator of Spider-Man, but in our next installment we'll look at his remaining issues before the torch for artists is passed to another iconic writer, John Romita Sr.